pleasure to be here with all of you today. And as Yamini said, the last CPR dialogues happened in March 2020. And I was recalling that the title we chose for that panel was, "What would happen if we were to believe in Indian agriculture?" And we had a terrific panel because, Harish was at that time not yet at CPR, was one of the panelists. Ajay Jhakar, who's here in the panel this morning and is here again today. Saurabh Garg, who was also here this morning and at that time was Secretary of Agriculture in Odisha, and Ramesh Chand of Niti Aayog. And I think in the title, we were actually implying that we don't really believe in Indian agriculture. In a sense, agricultural policy doesn't believe in agriculture. It believes in agriculture quite a lot as if it is a stalled structural transformation and a drag. At best, something that we have to think about as welfare rather than as a huge engine of growth and multiplier for the economy. Interestingly, I think shortly after that, and quite tragically in some senses, we realized how much Indians believe in agriculture as people walked home. And it reminded me so much of a conversation we've had so many times in the field where laborers who work in cities during an off-season hold on to their farms and remind us that when the cities close, we will still have our farm. And that the source of land and agriculture was always much more than simply a sort of livelihood trade-off, which is how we think about it when we think about structural transformation. And so we have this challenge of a huge number of Indian farmers who do much more than farming. But this reality of the role that agriculture plays as one of the most remarkable and absorbent sponges, but also one that we continuously characterize and see has become like this swamp. So the big challenge of the structural transformation sort of is facing us. Harish in the year after was actually at CPR in 2021, which was wonderful as a senior fellow before returning to the Indian Express. And we used this opportunity really in that post-COVID 2021 moment to produce, along with Yamini and with our colleague Samriddhi, a series of notes which we've released over the last year, 11 to 12 notes, trying to unpack and understand the rural economy and its really complex linkages. I would urge all of you to take a look at those notes. But today, taking off from that, what we began to see were all of these challenges. And so Harish will make a brief presentation to begin that captures some of those dynamics that we saw, focusing a little more on agriculture. And then we have really, really excited to have Amit and Sudhir here to both reflect and respond to some of these insights and to the data and the analysis, but also to help us understand what else we're missing in terms of understanding demand, understanding consumption, understanding non-farm livelihoods, the linkages with agriculture, and thinking differently about labor. So with all of that, we will then take the opportunity to think about if we were to really immerse ourselves in the realities of the rural economy, what would it take to have a new imagination for thinking about policy that then takes the rural economy seriously? So I'll start with Harish, who will make a presentation, and then we'll move to the panel.
Yeah, I'm audible, right? Yeah, thanks. Okay, I thought we'll take off on the theme of structural transformation, in rural India, what has been happening. So I thought that these are some of the drivers of structural transformation which has been happening and maybe has been stalled, if not reversed, in the last few years. So I think there are basically three indicators. One is dietary diversification. That is the diversification of diets. And that is accompanied by cropping diversification. That is, farmers produce a much bigger range of crops, okay? And the third is to do with the diversification of the rural labor force itself, okay? So when we look at the dietary diversification, it's basically a movement away from, calorie-based foods, basically cereals and sugars, to foods that are more, more rich in proteins, milk, fish, egg, chicken, etc., fat, and of course micronutrients, basically vitamins and minerals, etc. And there is enough evidence of such diversification of diets happening, and that's what our NSS surveys revealed, various rounds. And that very clearly shows that, your per capita consumption of cereals and sugar is declining or stagnating. Like you can see the data, how, sugar, this is, so both rural and urban, so you see it over a period of time, okay? And some of these movements are very interesting. Like, for example, you see how chicken has gone up. Chicken has gone up, but not mutton, which is goat meat. And that has probably to do with mainly to do with technology. Your hybrid broilers. Thanks to the likes of Venky's and Suguna, right? I mean, so today you have broilers which can grow to say about 2 to 2.5 kg from hardly 35 to 40 gram chicks, to live broilers within maybe 6 weeks, whereas earlier the backyard hens, etc., which we used to have, maybe it used to take about, say, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, and in today's poultry farms you have starting with, say, about 2,000 birds going up to 10,000 birds. So because of that, you can see that in both the rural as well as urban. So you didn't have this kind of a revolution in goat meat. So mutton, you see it has been more or less stagnant, whereas chicken, in both in rural and urban, it just it just goes up, and so that has been happening. Plus your eggs, milk, and whereas you can very clearly see your cereal consumption coming down and sugar coming down. So I think this has been, by and large, the story of dietary diversification which has been happening. Okay, and so what have been the drivers of this dietary diversification? Number one is, of course, rising incomes. As incomes rise, people consume whatever superior foods over inferior foods. But I'll say that it also had to do with improved production technology. Like, for example, you see, for example, hybrids in vegetables. When I came to Delhi, about, say, 35 years ago, the only vegetable I could find during summers used to be tinda. I think round gourd, right? Yeah. But today you get tomatoes even in summer, right? Like tomatoes are grown during the Kharif season, that is the rainy season. It's grown in the Rabi season. In places like Kolar in Karnataka and Sangamner, Junnar, that belt, you also have farmers who grow summer tomatoes, and the yields are very high, about 40 tons per acre. I mean, the best Punjab farmer may get about 7.5 tons of paddy and maybe 5 tons of wheat, whereas in tomato with hybrids you get 40 tons, 45 tons very easily. And I'll say that in the case of in the case of vegetables, what has done really the trick has come because of hybrids. Many I think the hybrid seed penetration must be at least 75% in all vegetables other than onion and potato. So whether it's in tomatoes, chilies, okra, cabbage, cauliflower, cucumber, capsicum, all the gourds, these are all hybrids. And same has happened with maize, okay, fodder crops. Okay, and of course, now even banana cultivation. It's you have both drip irrigation and tissue culture, and along with it also high density planting. The planting of bananas very close together. So, and of course AI is not artificial intelligence. Something more interesting, artificial insemination. So and you had. Both your buffaloes as well as cows. I mean, it's unimaginable, all the semen coming from bulls in, a few stations, and even animals in Assam or Kerala getting, inseminated from bulls coming from from one station, So I think this is something which happened maybe, I don't know, maybe 20 years, 30 years, this kind of thing which we had, okay? And same, I would say, infrastructure, I think the best example I would say is with three-phase power. Earlier when dairies had to procure milk, the milk had to reach the dairy by say about 11:30 in the morning, okay, because otherwise the milk gets spoiled. So that means the milk had to be collected from the village at say 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, which means the people had to start milking the cows at about 5 o'clock, right? And the farmers are also in a hurry, right? Because, so therefore, there's a limit to how many cows you can milk or how many buffaloes you can milk. But once you had three-phase electricity, once you had village bulk coolers, capacity maybe, 1,000 liters or 10,000 liters in the village. So the farmer could, it didn't have to get up at 5 o'clock, you could, the tanker from the dairy can come at say 11 o'clock, so there's more time. So, and along with it, you also have milking machines. So because of this, what has happened is your herd sizes have increased, Earlier, maybe, the farmer would have been keeping, 1 or 2 cows, 3 buffaloes, whereas now I have more time, right? And so I think all these have been very important, So both the production technology and incomes, okay? And you can see the results, what happened. You had enormous cropping diversification, If you look, for example, milk production, tripling, right? I mean, egg production, I think, 9 times, right? Poultry meat 4 times, everything. I mean, vegetables also, tripling. And whereas you can see that cereals, hardly, right? Sugar, hardly, So basically about 1.5 times, whereas what you had was more production of non-cereals, non-sugar. So I'll say dietary diversification and cropping diversification both happen together, okay? And wherever there was technology for production, okay, supply response happened through higher production by farmers, okay. Where there was no technology, where there was no private enterprise, where there was no supportive private policy, whatever increase in demand happened, it took place because through imports. Okay, so you see how India's edible oil import bill just it went up. There was no support. Whereas in all other crops, whether it is dairy, etc., there was either private enterprise or there was a supportive government policy, right? I mean, whether it was breeding, whether it was so we see the increase in demand for both vegetable protein and fats, right? Which is again part of dietary diversification that was met by imports, but in all the others, I mean, I think your fruits, vegetables, it has been largely because of improved production technology and our ability of farmers and agribusinesses to respond. Okay, and the third diversification which happened was in the rural labor force. Actually, my colleague Samriddhi and I, we wrote a piece in the Indian Express where we tried to say that the number of serious farmers in India. When we said serious farmers, that is farmers who actually depend more on farms. At least 50% of their income comes from farming. So I may call myself a farmer, but the income from farming is hardly anything. So we went by the case and that's what we said. Farm income dependent agricultural households. Okay, so we estimated that there are only about maybe about 40 million at the most. These are the real sort of serious farmers. What we were trying to say, but I think we got a little bit of there was a lot of misunderstanding. I think even Mekhla didn't agree with what we were saying. But anyway, that's part of, I think, CPR tradition, right? But what you see is again, when you had dietary diversification, cropping diversification, more income, so you had also a fall in the share of the workforce in agriculture. And you can see that the sharpest fall was, between 2004. I mean, this is based on the NSSO surveys, So the sharpest fall was during that period, when global crop prices were good and all these virtuous things came together. I think the 2011-12 census was the first, the survey was the first where it fell below 50%, and below 50%. And what is interesting is that the number of people who were engaged in agriculture came down in absolute numbers, This has never happened. This was the first time in Indian, recorded history, that the number of people in farms came down actually, so both as a percentage and in absolute terms. Okay, so and this is the numbers. This is the whatever figures which we estimated. The percentage of so-called agricultural households who are actually farm income dependent. So you can see, like my state, there are hardly any serious farmers. 1%. So yeah, and as I said, what was common in all these things was your rising incomes. When incomes rise, there is more dietary diversification, right? So I think the example which we are giving is, to compare milk versus cereals. Indians are lacto vegetarian, right? I mean, the moment incomes increase, right? I mean, people move from vanaspati, that is vegetable ghee, to milk ghee, right? I mean, so and that's what happens. So you can see how this is a 2011-12 household consumer expenditure data. You can see that in rural areas, I think in the 7th fractile. In the 10th fractile, the share of milk overtakes cereals. Okay, and in urban areas, of course, it's the 7th. It's much earlier. At the share of cereals comes below milk. So this is something which happened. So I think rising incomes was the main factor which was driving this dietary diversification. And the reason for it is, of course, I think the best indicator is rural wages. Because since this belongs to the people who are in the most bottom rung society, so you can see how wages grew. The nominal, both in nominal as well as real terms. That is after adjusting for inflation. You see the increase in wage growth to be. It was quite significant during that particular period. Okay, so now what is possible, I think, in the days ahead. This is something which we need to sustain this kind of a cropping diversification, and the problem in India is, and we need to use, I think MSP can be an instrument to enable this kind of a cropping diversification, and right now, much of MSP is, the coverage is only for 4 crops, basically sugarcane, paddy, wheat. So the first 3 are entirely cereal and calorie-based foods, and so I would say that we need to go with a program for reducing. I think even Ajayji talked about, how do you bring down the paddy area in Punjab, right? It's about something like 3.1 million hectares, So what are the crops that can be grown in its place? Like in Punjab, I think soybean is a very viable alternative because in Madhya Pradesh, soybean is grown, you have to sow very early because farmers are constrained to plant wheat, by October 15th, by the end of October. Whereas in Punjab, you can grow soybean, which is about, say, 135 day crop, and you can get much higher yields. You can get at least close to US Midwest yields, maybe 3 tons per hectare. Whereas in Madhya Pradesh, you are growing 90 to 100 day soybean and you're getting 1 ton. So if the farmer gets 3 tons and he's assured the MSP, and I think that is where, it should be legal, So I believe that we should have, MSP should be made legal, but it should be linked to crop area planning. Okay, that is, if farmer grows, moves from paddy to soybean to maize, the government will guarantee the MSP. How? Not necessarily by procuring and buying. You can pay the price difference, and I think that's what should be done. So I think crop diversification. This is something which should be done. So this is one priority. Structural reform, which I will say. The second structural reform, I think, is India needs to move away from DAP, urea, muriate of potash. You don't need 46% nitrogen in fertilizer. You don't need 46% phosphorus and 60% potash, etc. And India doesn't have any. I mean, we don't have natural gas. We don't have rock phosphate. We don't have potash. No sulfur. Okay, so we cannot sustain this. So this is what I have estimated, something. I think last year our total import bill of fertilizers, which includes both the finished fertilizers and the imported ingredients, basically the intermediates and all. I think it was about nearly $25 billion, and this year's subsidy bill is going to be, 25 billion. So this is simply not sustainable, whether it is fiscally, whether it is environmentally. So we should shift to low analysis fertilizers. So instead of DAP, go for single superphosphate, 16% phosphorus, but 11% sulfur. Okay, and I think this is something which we should be doing. I think there should be compulsory incorporation of urease and nitrification inhibitors, because a lot of urea, there is a lot of volatilization losses, because of ammonia, etc. And nitrification, there is a lot of leaching of nitrogen which happens. So we need to, with the same bag of urea, we should be able to, more nitrogen from the same bag of urea, which can happen if you ensure that the nitrogen release is slow. It's a little. So I think, this is another. This is the third thing. I mean, definitely, I think in Punjab we are seeing. I think this year I did see quite a lot of direct seeded rice. Okay, and quite a few farmers, I did see the thing. And in Punjab, you have Lucky Seed Drill as well as Happy Seeder, right? I mean, they have these nice names. So, and I think this was a very big thing last year, 2021-22. Everybody talks of the heat wave which happened in March. I think, yes, that was damaging. It completely finished off India's wheat crop, and we suddenly banned wheat exports after after claiming that India will feed the world. Suddenly we realized that we don't have a crop. But I think a bigger damage was caused earlier. Because never before has India had excess rainfalls 5 successive months, September, October, November, December, January, So like a farmer in Jhajjar in Haryana, he was telling me, because he lost his mustard crop, that was in January, because of excess rains, okay, when the crop was in late flowering or early seed setting stage, and he lost his wheat because of temperatures, high temperatures in March. So March temperatures hit wheat, and January excess rains hit mustard. Okay, so you had both El Nino and La Nina. La Nina is something, I mean, this year we are having a triple dip La Nina, right? I mean, 3 years. I mean, this episode started in September 2020, and now, I think most global models are saying that it might last till the end of this year. Okay, so we need to invest more in this thing. There are just a couple of slides more. So this is the thing which we are, talking about. Has this earlier structural transformation which we were talking about, has it really stalled, And as we showed in an earlier slide, you can see that, it was falling, right? I mean, but the pace of reduction, you can see it has been slowing and reversed, So now, the share of workforce in agriculture has gone up, okay? So very clearly, when it comes to your labor force diversification, that is reversing. Okay, we don't have any data on consumption. How much milk are households consuming? How much dal households are consuming? We don't have any data after 2011-12, and we make policy. It's remarkable how you're doing it. And I think the best example is I think milk. I mean, every year government says your 6.2% growth in milk production, and God knows how. And whereas the sales, if you go, and this is what I mean. The cooperatives, the sales has been hardly growing by 2.5%, and private sector dairies. I've taken basically 12 dairies, relatively big. Even their growth, if you adjust for inflation, it's hardly 3.6%. So very clearly what the government is saying on production is not gelling with what is happening on the ground. And if milk sales aren't increasing, that means your dietary diversification is in serious trouble. Okay, and this is, of course, a story before the last, say, 6-7 months. You can see the fact that cropping diversification has slowing down. You can see how the stocks were building up, of rice and wheat. This is before, and this is just before the climate shocks. Okay, and sugar, you had the way your stocks were increasing. That means farmers were, instead of producing more fruits and vegetables and other crops, they are producing more of rice, wheat, and sugarcane. Why? Because you have assured return, right? I mean, so farmers have turned risk averse, just like any businessman, right? Like any investors, they have turned risk averse. Okay, and probably, and also your rural wage growth, it's, hardly, 0.1% growth, since 2014-15, and I think Sudhir will be able to educate us more on FMCG sale. Like, I had never heard of terms like down trading, grammage reduction, shrinkflation. I had never heard of these terms, but I think these have become now, which every FMCG company is saying. So. So now there are challenges, whether short and medium. Like what Ajay was saying is absolutely correct. Now the government will want Punjab farmer to produce more rice and wheat. Why? Because your public stocks have fallen. Okay, so they'll say, hey, you grow more paddy, more rice, right? So the government will be very focused on the short term, right? So your sugar stocks are a 5-year low, your wheat stocks are a 14-year low, total stocks are this thing. So we are now back to, from age of surplus to, so banning exports, all these things, stocking controls. And so I think this is broadly, so it's probably it's a stalled kind of a transformation. Sorry, I've taken a little longer. Yeah.
Thanks, Harish. I think the great thing about being both at CPR and particularly getting to work with Harish, who will give you a different story based on the data every time virtually you sit, including contradicting himself the next day, and then having us do this. It's been fantastic to work on this with you. And I think the point that you made, which is, we disagreed on whether to think about farmers as serious or not based on whether they were earning enough income from farming, because land plays multiple roles, and the point about land actually being insurance for many farmers. But I think what we don't disagree on is that the vast majority of Indian farmers increasingly depend on non-farm income. What we also don't disagree on is that we have a persistently large number of farmers who are small and medium cultivators, and they are neither consolidating nor shifting. This doesn't mean that land relations are not being reconfigured in different regions in different ways continuously, but we are not seeing a shift out of small farming either. So I think this is something that we've all seen. I'm going to turn, Amit, first to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Zoom. In a second, we will know whether we can hear you as well as see you. But it's a real pleasure to have you here, because we've learned so much in recent times from your work on the rural farm, non-farm relationships, the rural-urban relationships, and thinking about labor and employment. So I'll turn to you first, in a sense, to maybe begin towards the end where Harish left, right? Which is, we can debate whether this is stalled structural transformation or it was pretty slow anyway, and we were in quite an unusual context nationally, when you look comparatively, but also this particular moment, and your reflections both, on some of the insights from the presentation, but your own reading of what we are experiencing and characteristics of this rural economy. I'll turn to you first.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. That's great.
Okay, hopefully not too loud. So thank you very much for inviting me and for accommodating this online mode. I know it's not ideal at all. Not for me either. I would very much have liked to be there. But unfortunately, teaching semester has its own restrictions. Let me maybe just take 10 minutes so that we have time to hear from Sudhir and also another sort of round of, we can go around. Um, First, let me say that with Mekhla and Harish here, I feel very, very scared to say anything about agriculture. People very much more deeply knowledgeable than me.
Problem at his end? Do you want to? No, you're back. Amit, we lost you for just a second.
Yes, I wonder if it's my internet or. Anyway, I was saying that I will be brief, take about 10 minutes. And I will not say much about agriculture because there are people far more knowledgeable than me here on the panel. In fact, I'm afraid to say anything about agriculture. So I will stick my remarks to, just structural transformation and the kinds of questions that you raised, Mekhla. Now, whether we call it stalled, whether we call it slow, these are all sort of terms that or labels that different people will be comfortable with. But what we can do is sort of characterize its nature, and that is what maybe I'll just spend a few minutes on. What is the nature of India's structural transformation? Clearly, something is happening. What is that? And I'm coming at it mostly from the employment angle, a little bit output also, but mainly employment. So if we look at it in cross-country perspective and just sort of ask the question for India's level of GDP per capita in PPP terms, do we have a sectoral structure that is expected? Just in a statistical sense, is it expected? And what we find is broadly the agricultural share of employment is along the lines of where we would expect India to be given its GDP per capita. Maybe a little bit higher than expected, but not by much. However, where we really stand out in the cross-country data is in the share of informality or informal workers in the workforce for our level of GDP per capita. This is not very hard to make sense of. I mean, all of us understand that a lot of the transition from agriculture has gone into construction, retail, and other kinds of sectors like this, where informality is the norm. Analytically, the important point here is that the Indian economy is a very prominent case of economic dwarfism, and the transition into SME/modern firms is much slower than the transition out of agriculture. Right? So people are indeed leaving agriculture, but the scale of production, at least as far as the NSSO type surveys reveal, remains very small. Now, there is a question here as to whether we are measuring scale appropriately. Entrepreneurs are notoriously difficult when it comes to answering questions about how many workers they employ. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if we are underestimating it and people are just not telling the truth of how many people are on their payroll. But I don't think we are going to be off by a huge margin. So even if we double the average firm size in India, it still remains very, very tiny. We're talking about a handful, less than 10 workers on average. So that is really, where the structural transformation is really worrisome, the nature of it. Just to give you one number, as per the NSSO surveys, the share of the organized sector in employment didn't budge between 2011-12 and 17-18 or 18-19. It just stayed fixed at around 22 or 23% of the workforce, which is very distressing. So the result of this kind of transformation is persistent informality and surplus labor. Of course, we understand that. But paradoxically, we also have labor shortages and firms routinely complaining about not finding workers. So you have to kind of explain how this puzzle comes about, that on the one hand, we are a surplus labor economy, and yet firms have labor shortages. And the reasons are, again, not hard to find. Some of it relates to the nature of the transformation itself. As you were pointing out, Harish, that there's all of these people who are in the farm sector, but whose income is declining from farming. However, they are not actually giving up farming. That's the flip side of this, that you're holding on to land, you're holding on to some amount of production, and either that is because of the insurance value of the land or the emotional social value of the land, various things can be going on, but there is a reluctance to give it up and relocate in a permanent sense, which makes you a different kind of a citizen or a different kind of a worker altogether. That doesn't seem to be happening, whether that is because of caste-based insurance networks or other reasons. There are a lot of explanations out there. But we seem to be looking at a workforce that, if not immobile, is at least severely restricted in mobility. And when it comes to women, that is even more clear. Just one thought experiment is, if our female labor force participation rate were to double as we want it to, we become genuinely a labor surplus country, and everybody's wages go to the floor, right? So obviously, a section of the workforce is benefiting hugely from the restrictions that women have on mobility that prevent them from participating in the workforce. Of course, I'm not suggesting that the key missing part here is labor demand. So whenever we talk about increasing labor force participation of women, it is meaningless unless we are talking about increasing labor demand at the same time. Otherwise, we're just talking about pushing down wages. So there is a kind of mobility restriction angle here, which makes us a peculiar economy, and perhaps also feeds into the lack of structural transformation itself. That the lack of availability of surplus labor in the classical sense also means that firms at the margin, they're actually facing relative labor capital ratios that are quite different from what we think they might be, in the sense that labor is not that cheap. So decisions, can go in the capital-intensive direction, not creating jobs. So you observe this phenomenon and say, why are you not creating jobs? Why are we not doing well at labor-intensive manufacturing and so on? Maybe we just are not a labor surplus economy where it really matters, in ways that it really matters. And the one last question, relevant thing here is human capital. I mean, we have a huge legacy problem of lack of investment where it mattered in elementary education and health, with the result that we have a lot of problems to do with anthropometric measures still not doing as well as they could, educational attainments and the quality of education at the very basic level remaining poor and so forth. I'm not talking about quality of graduates. I'm just talking about the quality of 10th standard pass people and so on. So there is a problem here on the supply side of the labor market as well, of the educational kind. And the last point is aspirational wages. I mean, I think a lot of the times, uncharitably, people will say to entrepreneurs who are complaining that I don't get workers, well, you just increase your wages and you'll get workers. So clearly workers have something in mind about what incomes they would like to earn, which the private sector is not fulfilling. And this you really see at the upper end. And this you see in the rural economy too, or, graduates and so forth who are endlessly studying for competitive exams and other things. There is a whole period of your 20s when you show up either as unemployed or studying and so on in the labor force statistics, and then magically nobody is unemployed after 30 years of age, because you get tired looking for your aspirational job and you don't make it into the government job and so on, and then you do what you do, and that gap between the private sector wage and the aspirational wage is huge. Which matters a lot for labor supply decisions, at least at that age when you think you can afford to wait. And the number of people who think they can afford to wait has increased because incomes have increased. Even in the rural areas, this is the case. I'll just very quickly say something about where do we go from here as a new policy imagination. Clearly, creation of jobs at aspirational wages in large numbers is the predominant policy challenge as far as the structural transformation goes. But we don't know exactly how to go about it, and the reason is it's a very complicated problem on both the supply and the demand side of the labor market. Many interventions are needed, and much has been written about this, so I won't go into great detail here. But let me just say a few things. I think there are some mundane things, so to speak, that everybody talks about and we've been talking about for years, but we still haven't solved. Mekla, your work has nicely shown how local agricultural markets, how they are structured, and we understand what needs to be done in terms of public investment to improve bargaining power of farmers so that you don't get these year after year stories of distress sales and so forth, which are really eminently avoidable. If you had storage, if you had local value addition investments, you wouldn't need to put people in this position, and that would increase incomes significantly in the rural areas. So those are kinds of very commonplace ideas. We have failed to give adequate public investment, and public investment is the complementary good to private investment. Private investment doesn't work without public investment. Instead, what you get is people seeing that their efforts are not being rewarded in terms of returns. Right? So you do all you can with fertilizers, with seeds, all the private stuff that is in your control, and then one simple kind of bad monsoon or other shock wipes you out, which is a continuing problem. So there are all of these things that I think we all understand. I won't spend time on them. Instead, I wanted to just in 2 minutes say something where perhaps we can spend a little bit more time thinking, which is how do we get excited about this space, huge space that exists between villages and the metros, which has a whole range of small towns in it, which some of which are very, very rural and agriculture in character, very closely connected to the countryside. Sociologists have been talking about the urban phenomenon for a while. There's an urban mission, so clearly the policy thinking also acknowledges this. I think there is a very nice potential, imaginative convergence that can be imagined between urban mission type policies, between Sfurti type, signal that we care about a sector of the economy that is traditional clusters, and MG Narega and a potential urban employment guarantee. So I think all of these can come together very nicely to create the critical public infrastructure needed for small clusters to succeed in all across India. So you're talking about a really dispersed model of the non-farm economy instead of pushing people into all of these difficult choices that they have to make. I'll not say more right away. Maybe if I have time to expand, I can do that. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amit. That was really, really terrific. And I'll come back. I think this last point you made about how do you get excited about this space, I think CPR's urban team will say, come hang out with us and with you. One way to get excited about exactly that space of the middle. But also, I think it's a really important point that takes us to thinking about regions differently. As well. So I'll come back in that second round when we close to actually get some perspectives on how do we think about this regionally. But you've given us, I think, so many dynamics to think through. Sudhir, before we ask you what are all those terms that Harish was talking about as FMCG speak, but I think it would be just fantastic because I think so many of us who look a lot at production and we look at agriculture and we look at income, whatever data we get, the dynamics of understanding consumption and demand is something that is obviously core when you're thinking about consumer goods, thinking about FMCG, think about food and value chains. And so it would be great to just hear how and what we may be missing by looking at this data. What are either types of data or stories that we are missing as well. So, on to you.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, thanks for that, Mekla. No, I think I'll just spend a few minutes responding to Harish, and I'll look at it from a different perspective, which is, I'm not a very lettered man, so I don't read very much, but I travel quite a lot. So I'll just tell you what I observe in response to what Harish has said. I think firstly, and both these areas are of interest to me, and I keep exchanging messages with Harish, who I'm a real fan of, because he's one of the few people who really sort of goes below the surface when he writes. I think one is on dietary diversification, and then secondly, I'll talk a little bit about my observations on this reduction of the importance of agriculture in employment that I observe. I think in dietary diversification, one of the interesting things I observe, and then I've been observing over the years, and then I went back to data, is, fundamentally food policy, I guess we should look at it from the point of view of health. And if you look at, if you go to various parts of India, and I now travel across the world, there are three big public health challenges, and I'm just going to work backwards. One is diarrhea, and the numbers are very clear. Two is anemia, which is lack of iron, and three is stunting. These three are significantly higher in India compared to other $2,000 economies. And you can see it. If you go to villages, you will see small kids like I do in Africa as well with protruded bellies, very short, etc. Of these three, two of them are largely to do with protein deficiency. Diarrhea has got another problem. So if you go back to the fundamental health problem that I observe when I travel in India compared to, let's say, Chile or even South Africa, is these two. Then if you ask the question, why is India protein deficient, you'll see that our relative price of protein to carbohydrate, it's sort of linking to Harish, is one of the worst in the world. So our carbohydrate prices, let's say if you go to a Tesco and look at rice prices, we are 1/3, 1/4. If you look at protein prices, even on absolute terms, chicken and all are 10 to 20% more. And while Harish is right in saying that protein consumption has gone up, had protein prices in India been more reflective of global prices, we would have seen these numbers shoot up even more so. If you then ask the question, why are protein prices in India high? The answer is that our public, and these things you guys are experts on, not me, but our public policy since the 60s has been on calorie sufficiency, which we achieved some time ago, and it is not on diet diversification. So all our subsidies continue to go towards carbohydrates, and both meat and milk are negatively, and we can have a discussion, Harish is again the expert on it. Milk also, both of us share our views on milk, are negatively supported by the government, right? So now if the government finds it hard, and I'm now going to link this back to the second observation that I have, which is also linked to the agricultural composition of what people are doing in rural India. If you find it hard to make a transition between carbohydrates, fruit, to proteins and fruits and vegetables, you will not get adequate agricultural income in India. So if you don't get agricultural income in India, then people are not going to work in agriculture. And one of the things I now observe as I travel is not just the shrinkage that Harish is talking about of people working in agriculture, but I find a shrinkage of what is rural. So if you take, any average district in India, firstly, a district in India may be 5,000 odd square kilometers. So you have 5 tehsil towns, each of them, at a center of a square of 1,000 square kilometers. So it's 30 kilometers by 30 kilometers is where a tehsil town is. And you now see like a magnet, district headquarters are like a magnet attracting people, but even tehsil headquarters are becoming urban towns. So every district headquarters will now have a supermarket, will have a mall. Internet is extremely prevalent in all 600, maybe except in some really eastern parts of India, but generally. And I anticipate the tehsil headquarters also to become urban centers. So I think that whether or not public policy will change, I don't know, between carbohydrates and proteins. If it doesn't, then agricultural income will shrink further. I think you will have bigger and bigger urban centers, and we will willy-nilly, as we are doing in vegetable oils and even milk sooner than later, you will see that, I suspect there might have to be imports. So you may have to get globally integrated on agriculture and have a service-driven economy, and where rural also becomes part of this, like China, massive urban conglomeration in India. So this is just my response to Harish from what I see in general. Thanks.
But just a quick follow-up on that. This sense that one of the things that we saw in the data was there was this period where there was both, it seemed like market-based, so the income and dietary diversification with agricultural diversification. As Harish said, there's very little data since 2012 in terms of consumption, right? Being able to really map the same story, and we don't know whether we will be able to do that, going forward. We'll have to understand. So the little data that we were able to look at, from regular studies, which is the CMI data, showed very flat, now flattening dietary diversification. And there is now this question of how to think about the present. And I think what Harish was pointing to, that there's the present and then there's the medium term and the long term. But at the moment, this discussion around demand, even rural demand, seems to be, at least a very challenging situation. Is that matching what you're observing as well?
Yeah, I am. So, this, and I can link this to diet diversification, which is diet diversification is a function of income growth and price of proteins and fats, right? So price of proteins and fats are where they are. Income growth definitely in the last 7-8 years has slowed down in India. So I feel the 3 years it has definitely slowed down. In the 3 years of COVID, it has definitely slowed down. I suspect it has slowed down over a 7-8 year period. And the reason I suspect it is that in countries like us, FMCG growth is usually about 25% more than GDP growth. So I find it easier to believe the FMCG statistics than the GDP study, because it's a population study, it's not a sample study, right? So definitely the last decade GDP growth has probably come down, and this is, I think the issue started actually in 11-12, not in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't think it's demonetization, or I think are the superficial causes. I think it's a full decadal issue of 11-12. I think the FMCG growth has come down from high single digits to mid single digits in terms of volumes. So you can back calculate. So if you lose 200 to 300 bips of GDP growth, then the diet diversification will slow down because incomes have slowed down. So there's definitely, and the last 3 years have been particularly bad, but having said that, the last 3 years in India have probably been better than the rest of the world in terms of COVID, but for, GDP growth in the last 3 years has been 2.5%. So I would suspect that that's the cause of the diet diversification slowdown. It's a general economic slowdown is there. Or not a slowdown, I mean a 5% or 6% growth economy is not bad, but it's not an 8-9% growth economy that we were seeing between, let us say, 2004 and 11.
Thank you very much. I think I know there will be lots of questions, and so I do want to leave some time, and there are a couple of people I would also, love to hear from in the audience. But I think just to maybe take the next few minutes to think through if we were to have an imaginative or a different policy framework. And I think, Harish, you ended your presentation with a set of short-term and long-term challenges. And there's a real problem in the short term, in the way in which we are actually approaching the problem of agriculture. I mean, we are doubling down on cereals in a big way. We are actually going back to, and there's been a lot of conversation about the export bans. Now, just to think a little bit with all of you about if you had to do one round on in the short term, when you're handling these complexities, knowing that you have to think about the long term, and there is a complex negotiation to be done, how should we approach this, right? Like, what do you think would be some of the things we should do? And then we'll come around to the long term again, right? So we'll do quick, like just 2-3 things that you think right now, as we're emerging from a particular kind of COVID-centric economic policy to thinking about rural economy, agriculture, what would be the short-term sort of, directions, keeping in mind that there are these trade-offs, right? So, Harish, I'll start with you, then Amit, and then Sudhir, and then we'll come back to the long term, and particularly to regions.
Yeah, I think what Sudhir was talking about, first of all, the fact that, income growth definitely has slowed down. I think the difference between India and the West is that I think our household balance sheets have been impacted very badly in the last, 3-4 years, whereas probably in the West, because of stimulus, etc., and probably households had something to save, So I think that is the big difference between India and the West, So we had a problem of twin balance sheet problem, basically corporates and banks. Now that has been sorted out. Okay, 5 years back, government balance sheets were okay, household balance sheets were okay. Okay, they were driving the thing. Today, government balance sheets are bad and household balance sheets are bad. So the tools, I mean, there's not much that the government can do today. I mean, you look at the way the bond prices, I mean, the bond yields, etc. So that will naturally sort of keep a lid on what the government can do in terms of spending resources. So it was a very opportunistic response at that time. We had huge stocks of rice and wheat, and we just gave that out, and now you have become a victim to that thing, because people have got used to free rice and free wheat, and there was nothing else that we gave to most of our people, right? I mean, there was no income and nothing. So I don't know short term what can be done. Short term it is you can't obviously increase income and all these kind of things. But I would definitely not have extended this Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana for 3 months and 6 months and all these things, because I don't think we can really afford it. We don't have that kind of grain, and plus you are sending the wrong signals. You are basically telling the farmer again, grow more sugarcane, grow more rice, grow more wheat. So I think that's sending out a completely wrong message. And and at the same time banning exports. Whether of broken rice, whether of this thing. So I think short term, there is not much which can be done, precisely because government doesn't have money, and plus households also don't have money. So I think we'll have to entirely depend on what corporates do, what banks do. So I think this is, I think next 3-4 years are going to be a very challenging time for India. So I don't have any solutions right now. Yeah.
Okay. Moving on with that very bleak predicament, but I think there's actually something very important in thinking about how does one then take some of these decisions. And I think, here again, there will be Harish and I have this constant nuancing of things where he is like, they're getting used to it. And I'm like, no, they're not. It tells you how much they depend on it. But I think the point is the same, that there is a huge dependence. And I think that's important to understand, that we have gone back to rice and wheat for a reason, because they were the only things we have invested in over a very long time. We have only built those systems for rice and wheat. And if we wanted to do it, particularly around proteins, edible oils, and many of the other questions of how does one actually have a diversified food procurement and distribution system that at least is responsive to some of this. I think that is not a short-term solution. And so we can come back to that, but I think we don't have an option now but to think about that. Amit, again, just on the particular moment, but it also may point to a longer or a larger challenge, is this question of, distress formalization. As some people and a lot of analysts like Pranjal Bhandari and others have been talking about, and you made this very important point, that the degree of informalization is still surprising given the level of GDP per capita, and that is something we have to understand. And yet COVID has thrown up this whole question, and I don't know whether people are looking at it with optimism that we are formalizing in this way, or at least the formal seems to be doing better. And I think it is a policy question. Do you see this as a good moment? A lot of questions about, is this going to be forced? We have to force ourselves into formalization, and only in this very painful way can we do it. Or is there another way to think about how you approach the question of formalization so that it isn't as it is today, distressing?
Yeah, so let me start by putting even more of a downer on it than Harish did, because I don't see any reason why corporate investment should do anything at this point, right? Because wages are, leading into COVID, real wages were actually falling in many places. And this is before COVID. So, we had a slowdown going into COVID. COVID made it worse. The government debt has gone up. So I don't see why private investment will respond. No amount of moral suasion is going to work. So, but to go back to your question, my view on this is that, if by formalization we mean a worker who works for a firm who is part of a registered net of whether pay taxes or whatever it is, then it is the expansion of those firms that matters, and they will hire the workers that get in. Forcing firms that are tiny and unproductive to register, I don't think really means much. You're not going to be able to do much resource generation from them. You're not really going to be able to police whether they follow anything that you think they should be following. So I don't really understand, why we should care so much about it. There's a different thing about worker registries and, BOCW kind of roles, those kinds of things, e-Shram. If you want to construct some of those databases to deliver benefits better, all of that, sure. If we had a better system, maybe the Jan Dhan transfers could have reached far more people during COVID than they did. And perhaps you would have relied less on food and more on cash transfers. right? So we relied entirely on food, as Harish pointed out, and cash was minimal. So we could have improved the balance. That would have changed a few things. So creating those kinds of things, if that's what we mean by formalization, I think there's some merit to that. Otherwise, I think it's about the productivity of the enterprise and how large it is where it really matters. I'll just say one more thing. Not everybody had a miserable last decade. Some people did very, very well. And, the question then becomes, if you're seriously hamstrung, if you believe that you can't raise resources in the debt market, and private investment is not responding, and household balance sheets are in trouble, then the obvious thing to do is look at your tax policy very, very seriously and get resources from those who are doing very, very well. And that's not an insignificant number of people. You're going to get some real resources from there to jumpstart a proper fiscal stimulus. And if you're not thinking about it now, I don't know when you're thinking about it, because there's a lot of distress there which is not going to correct itself. So that is, the last thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not as pessimistic as Harish on this, and I'll tell you, I agree with him. Firstly, there's a balance sheet issue in consumers. I met a consumer 3-4 months ago outside Madurai, and her husband was a tourist taxi driver, and she had two problems. One is during COVID, he had no income, so they had to take from savings. Two is, I think, her mother-in-law died, and the funeral expense she had to borrow. So they were now building back savings and building back paying back the loan. This is the story across India. You'll find people. And basically what she was cutting back on was on milk, and she was cutting back on, she had 2 mobile phones with internet, she had reduced it to 1. So this is the general pattern across many parts of India. And she was also facing the problem of very high oil price inflation a few months ago, both vegetable and crude having gone up the way they did. So she was in an inflationary environment with a balance sheet issue, and consumption being cut was what we were observing. In this, some parts of the puzzle are getting better, which is, I think the inflation has slowed down. I think some of these COVID things, as savings build up, will come back. But I think this is the time for the government to spend and not to invest. I think government has done a really good job on spending a lot of money on infrastructure and investing. But this is the time to, for lack of a better word, handing out the dole for a few months to 6 to 9 months. Because that is what will be needed to revive consumption. And once you revive consumption, you can go back to and investing more. So that is what I think just that ignition trigger of, and I don't know what the best way of doing it is. It Jan Dhan or is it MNR? So I'm sure you guys know what is the best way of doing it. But if that is done for 6 to 9 months, I think there will be an ignition on the economy.
Thank you very much. I think we have about 10 minutes or so left. So,
can I make one quick
sorry,
point
yes,
here
please,
that-
Amit. Yeah.
Just on going back to Harish's slide of the rural wage growth,
Yeah.
I don't know who has done this, but if you link it to the introduction of NREGA and to the decoupling of NREGA wages from inflation and stagnating of NREGA wages in real terms, I think you will see some correlation between the rise, the rapid growth period, and the collapse. Just building on what Sudhir said, I think it's a very effective tool, NREGA, to provide support at the bottom end for wages and raise consumption.
Yeah. Thanks, Amit. I think that's actually work we should, if it's not been done, actually needs to be done, and we will do. So I think, just before I open it up, I think one thing that has become very clear, and we've been discussing the immediate term, but in the long term, one of the things all of your analysis is pushing us to understand is that having a new imagination for the rural economy is having an imagination for the Indian economy. Having an imagination for the rural economy is actually having an imagination for urbanizing India or the urban India. So having an imagination for rural India is also one about urban India. And then having an imagination for agriculture is actually about both industry in a very important sense, but also then about food systems and food, because we're looking at dietary diversification and where are we investing, and then clearly where Sudhir started us is having an imagination for health. which is what we talked about in the morning as well. The connection between air and health, the connection between food and health, these should not be so difficult to see, and yet they are continuously obscured in our work. So, I know there will be lots of questions, but I also cannot resist seeing Ajay Jhakar in the first row. And this last point, this point about food and health, and this structural transformation and thinking about agriculture. So maybe a couple of points, just your reactions, and then I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you for that. First, I'd want to say the topic of the session was new policy on imagining rural economy. We need to focus on census towns. We need to take this expansion away. This whole stupid smart city concept needs to be done away with. And we need to focus on census towns that the economy development can shift to the heartland. And then there is a food systems linkage, like Harishi, you were talking about chicken and eggs. When you have an objective, you say you need to increase the egg supply, then you go to industrial scale chicken farms where you have tens of thousands of eggs. As a farmers organization, we've been telling the government to have backyard poultry where eggs can be, a program where eggs are produced in the village and consumed as midday meal schemes in schools and Anganwadis and other structures. So there is, if you focus on an objective, you'll invariably come up with a process which is not good. So setting an objective or the process, everything has to go together. So I would just say that it is feasible to develop a new economy, but we need a new way of how we think the problem. First, we don't even define the problem properly, and we already think we have a solution, and then we start targeting at that solution. And that's the key of why people keep migrating. And from your data, I can only get one thing out that you missed out on, is that it's the first time, I think so, since the Chinese Cultural Revolution that we were able to send millions back to the rural economy.
Yes, I think the chicken and egg can be used for many things here in thinking about what we're doing with, how to think about the rural economy. But thanks very much. We have a few minutes for questions. So if there are any, yeah, I'll just take a few. Please.
Goat farming can't be scaled up, because you can't have stall-fed goats in thousands. It just doesn't work. I've kept goats and I can tell you that doesn't work.
Yeah, I think the important link about both infrastructure, technology, demand, all of it actually having to work together to see which of these actually grow. There's a question here, yes.
Amanil, there's a lot of concentration being kept on millets. So does that help? I want the panel may respond accordingly. They're rich in proteins and values, and the whole cycle is being geared up. And it's also going to help the rural economy, I suppose.
Yes. Thanks so much. While we wait for any other questions, both Harish and also Sudhir, so do you want to take a quick look at millets? The question is around, we've talked a lot about protein, but there is a focus. I know states like Odisha have a millet mission, and this is something that people have been talking about also because there's increasing urban consumption of millets, whether to put it in PDS, increased use in ICDS. It's an important question.
I would be more inclined to use millets in midday meal schemes, those kind of things. I think that can be the demand driver. And unless farmers get a good price, they're not going to grow. The moment you get irrigation, farmer is going to move away from bajra to, to maybe to cotton, to something else. So I would be personally more inclined to have more and more millets for, Anganwadis, for school. And these are not small. These are quite big markets, So I think that's how it should be. And I don't think urban demand is going to sustain millets. I can tell you that not many people know how to make bajre ka roti. It's very difficult, because once you start having wheat atta, you won't switch back to. It's impossible because wo banta nahi hai. It just wo bikhar jata hai. It's not, yeah.
There's another problem with millets that people have been pointing out is that we're treating it like a common category. And often when people are talking about millets, it's either bajra or it's ragi increasingly, and people are not actually looking, we call it millets, but there's a monocropping in the millets approach too that we need to kind of be quite careful about. But thank you very much for the question. Other questions. I'll take a few. Yes, go ahead.
Ma'am, I have two very short questions. First
Yeah.
question is that, sir, in presentation you have said that MSP is a legal tool for diversification. Sir, just for example, crop A, Government of India has decided that crop A will have MSP of 7,000 per quintal, and crop B will be have 10,000 per quintal. Sir, so it is natural that a farmer will grow crop B rather than crop A. So how can we say it is a crop diversification? Sir, my second question is food processing have a more important role in country like India than agriculture? Because some government like UP has started ODOP, one district, one program scheme, and has linked it with food processing. So is food processing having a more important role than agriculture?
Okay, I'll take that answer and then we'll come back. Yeah, no, but there aren't questions. Yes. Okay, so, yes, sorry, yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for Harish, and then I have a second question for the two of them. So the first to Harish is, can you take us through the practical problems that have held back the growth of edible oil, production on a much larger scale? That's number one. And number two is, I'm taking Sudhir's idea of the rural economy becoming more and more urbanized, less agricultural production happening because laborers are going away to these district towns. What role do you see for the corporates coming into agriculture, for the increase of land holding, lifting of land ceiling and so on? If we think, say, large holdings run by corporates, do you think that could solve some of the issues of these declining stocks? Yeah. So those are my questions.
Great, thank you very much. So, very brief question. Go ahead, but very brief.
Okay, I'll run through fast. Right?
No, one question, very brief.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Sir, a lot has been said about food and food production, but few sectors have been left out. The farmer distribution and security of the farmers. The question is the food production is not possible without the farmers. And it's not the technology that make it possible, it's the man behind the machine that make it possible. So the farmer is the main.
No, also women.
Right.
Yes.
The farmer, let's see about the farmer. Farmer is committing suicide. Farmer is not getting crop insurance. Farmer is not getting MSP. The marginal farmer is not getting social security. The farmers are debt ridden. Farmers have to sell their land. The marginal farmers, since independence, thousands and millions of acres have been sold out. They have been forced to sell it. They didn't sell it. They forced to sell it. They are now the landless laborers begging and working on the construction sites and all.
Yeah.
The farmer is being totally ignored, ma'am. The farmer should be taken
Sir,
in consideration and all that problem, especially the social security. They are
Yes.
heavily under debt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's an extremely important point to recenter the farmer, and to think about social security as part of this imagination.
Why?
Yes.
Why they committing suicide?
Yes. Thank you. No, I think it's very important that we return to that, and I just wanted to remind you all of the questions. So what we'll do is just to look, there was, the questions here, and then the questions on edible oils, and the overall, focus on urbanization, and maybe we can all three hear from each of you. And I'm going to throw in a request to Amit at the end to think about regions a bit as we, look forward. And yeah.
No, I'll answer two questions and I'll then sort of abstract into an answer. One is the question on food processing, and two is the question on corporate investment in palm oil, both of which I have some sort of outside knowledge of. See, on food processing, again, the core issue in food processing is the cost of the raw material of food. Where the cost is competitive, like wheat, we have the largest biscuit market in the world. Where the cost is not competitive, like milk, we have very low milk derivatives. So the essential issue on food processing development in India has to do with, are our raw materials competitive or not? If it's competitive, you'll be able to add value. Otherwise, no one's going to be able to afford the food processed if the raw material is not competitive. On palm oil, and I'll come back to what the sort of medium-term issue is. On palm oil, the issue is the Andhra government has been trying to get palm plantations and subsidize it, but it's not serious. It's not enough support from the government at a farmer level, and there are externalities involved. So to build an ecosystem of scale, the way, let's say, Indonesia and Malaysia have done for palm oil, requires serious government intervention. I mean, the private sector can buy, for example, Godrej is probably the largest plantation in India and the largest buyer also. So we are very involved in that sector. But that until and unless farmers are given, guarantees to move from rice to palm plantation, the long gestation periods, etc., it is very hard for the corporate to do this. And that's why, there's a problem in vegetable oils. I just want to take, and maybe that's the kind of last thing I want to say, is I think from a medium-term policy, we have two alternatives on the table. Either the government moves away from carbohydrate support to protein and fat support, which case there will be a very thriving agriculture and both these problems will get solved, food processing and palm plantation. But if that is very politically difficult to do, then to liberalize imports of these and say, okay, we can't make this transition. Many countries like France and US and all have said, we can't make this transition, it's too complicated to do. Then at least if you can bring the raw materials of price of protein and fats down by importing it, I think it's the second best alternative, frankly. The best alternative is to move it, but if that's not possible, but one of these two choices have to be made if you want to, whichever way you want to go on the journey.
Amit, shall I turn to you?
Meghla, I don't have that much really to add, so please, anyway, we're over time, so let Harish maybe respond to some of the points that came up.
Okay, great. We'll give Harish the last word for today, which will be his word for today. And you can check back with him tomorrow.
No, seriously, I believe it's not possible for India to become 100% self-sufficient in edible oils. It's not possible, okay? We can definitely reduce our quantum of imports from, say, 15 million tons to maybe 7-8 million tons, okay? So that particular delta, it can be through indigenous sources. And indigenous sources, I think we should be very clear what those sources can be. Oil palm, definitely, I think there is scope if the government really supports it, because the thing is, oil palm takes about 5 years for it to start delivering fresh fruit bunches, So for 5 years, there is no income for farmers. Of course, they can do a bit of intercropping, etc. But it's an investment for the farmer. Okay, so whether you will support that farmer during that particular period, okay? So I think there is definitely scope for maybe about, say, 3 million tons of palm oil to be produced in India, okay? I think the second source where we can increase is mustard. Okay, I think mustard, because there is demand, but the problem with our mustard is the genetic diversity is very weak. There is no. I mean, mustard today is what wheat was in the 50s and 60s. Okay, so we need hybrids. We need hybrids, and that can only happen maybe through genetic modification, whether we are willing to allow it, we need more and more of the crossbreeding, especially there's a lot of promise in Eastern Europe, crossing them with Indian this thing, and the hybrid vigor is very high. And a third source of, I think there are two other sources of edible oil where actually production has gone up a lot. One is rice bran, because higher rice production, so therefore more rice bran oil. And the other thing is actually cotton seed oil. Cotton seed oil has replaced groundnut seed oil in Gujarat, and more of groundnut is being exported. Groundnut has become more a sort of a dry fruit to go with drinks, rather than for cooking. That's what has happened. So I think that's what I would say. And regarding the MSP, yes, I think MSP should be made legal. Okay, the government should pay the MSP, because otherwise then don't declare MSP. Okay, but it should be conditional on farmers growing particular crops. Okay, I think crop area planning and MSP, these two together can go, and that is the road forward. And if the government doesn't guarantee an MSP, whether for oil palm or for this thing, if it doesn't backstop, you are not going to happen. And as Sudhir said, we'll have to go for the second best option of importing protein and fats. It's a terrible idea, but anyway, what to do? Yeah.
So you can trust Harish to leave us on questions of legal MSP and genetic modification.
Third point here, which is that for corporates to enter, we need better contracts and legal systems. Because if you want 5-year gestation periods, and we know where all this comes from, but it's absolutely crucial if you want big corporate private investments in palm oil in particular, I can tell you since I work in it.
This has really been an amazing, I'm sorry we're completely out of time, but this has been a really rich and insightful panel, particularly just the breadth of empirical detail, but also generalization. Amit, thank you so much for making it possible to join us on Zoom. And we look forward to having a next round at the next dialogues to go deeper. Thank you very much to all three of you.